So in this module of 8, we'll talk about the Entra ID. Earlier, we used to call it as an Azure AD, but now Microsoft is calling it as an Entra ID. So I split this into multiple small lessons. So in the first lesson, we'll talk about Entra ID overview. In the second lesson, we'll talk about the user accounts. Then third lesson, we'll talk about groups, then how we can enable multi-factor authentication. Then we'll talk about connect, how we can synchronize on-prem users to the Azure Entra. Then we'll talk about a feature called as a self-service password reset. Then we'll talk about Azure AD logs. So today in this video, so we'll focus more on the Entra ID overview. So Microsoft has various clouds, as we'd see Azure Cloud, which primarily provides on the infrastructure as a services, where it allows you to create virtual machines, containers, app services, then storage, where we can create file shares, tables, etc., as we have seen in the earlier modules. And similarly, the Microsoft 365, which we call it as a SaaS cloud, where Microsoft has MS Office, email, SharePoint, OneDrive, Dynamics, Teams. Like there are so many applications which are provided as part of the 365 cloud. So when customers subscribe to these services, so how are the customers are going to access these services? How the customers will be differentiated? It means that how each and every customer will be identified in Azure or in the O365 or in the Microsoft Cloud. And could be organizations might have multiple users where they access like an applications like 365, email, SharePoint. How are they going to authenticate in order to access these applications? Similarly, when organizations want to consume the virtual machines, containers, app services, and everything, how are they basically going to authenticate and do that? So in order to provide these services, okay, differentiate. So Microsoft came up with something called as an Entra ID, which is equals to called as an ID, Azure AD. So we might know that Active Directory in the on-premises environment, which is provides a centralized user management, group management, centralized, okay, device management, authentications, like many things. Now in the cloud, so Microsoft came up with called as an Entra ID. So this also provides an a user management. So it allows us to create users and where the users can log into the O365 and to the Azure, and where we can assign licenses and everything, and allows us to create groups to assign permissions. Instead of assigning permissions on individual user accounts, we can use the groups. And similarly, it provides called as a permissions management, which we call it as a role-based access control. And one of the feature which it provides, and various like in where it provides like a self-service password reset, where users can reset their own password, and provides security like in multi-factor authentication. Not only password, they can have some authenticator app and anything, and also provides a conditional access policies. Okay, if the user is coming from an organization device, we don't want to allow him to access, or if the user is coming from an outside of the corporate network, then we should not allow him to access the resources. Like there could be some multiple conditions where we want to set this one. Okay, so that kind of situations where we would see called as in the conditional access policies comes into picture, and that's where the Entra ID basically plays a key role in user management, groups, permissions, and authentication services. Authentication services. So when I mean by authentication services, the users want to access their own applications. Okay, so the Azure Entra ID can validate the credentials, whether the username and password and these things are correct. Based on that, it is going to allow it. Okay. So that is how it basically the Entra ID works. So what happens here now when we set up an Entra? So when we set up an account, either in O365 or in the Azure, so this, let's say this is an Azure or MS 365, the authentication services are common across these two clouds. It means that we don't have a separate authentication services for 365 and separate for Azure. So the Azure Entra ID, Azure Entra is the same for both. It's basically across the cloud, across the Azure and 365, the Azure Entra ID is the same. So now when we sign up for a 365 or when we sign up for an Azure for the first time, so Microsoft is going to create one Entra ID tenant. We call it as an Entra ID tenant. Like I would say called as in Ramana, like based on the email address which is being used for signing up these clouds or the organization name. Based on that, it is going to create one Entra ID tenant, which we call it as an example. I'm giving it like Ramana BBR dot on Microsoft.com. That is purely will be taken automatically by the Microsoft during the sign up process of the Azure or MS 365 service. This is the what we call it as a default tenant. Now, it allows to create a user account. So, like an username @ Ramana BVR dot on Microsoft.com. Similarly, group like in a groups like in a group one @ Ramana BVR dot on Microsoft.com. So for each and every a user or a group or a device which we are going to release through the Entra will be given an identity which is called as an @ the whatever the unique name and on Microsoft.com. So this is going to be unique across the globe. Okay. So no two customers can have the same name. So two customers cannot have the same name. So this particular name will differ based on organization to organization and during the setting of the process. And if you want to have additional this thing, we can create our own Azure Entra tenants. So additionally, we can create an additional tenants. So which we call them as additional tenants. Okay. Like I can say called as an @ okay, acutlan dot on Microsoft.com. So like this, we can set up our own these things. We can set up like this our own these things. So what happens with this one is so we call this a multi-tenant system. So within the one Azure account or Microsoft account, we can have multiple tenants. So when we are creating user accounts, we can choose whether we want to create a user accounts in this Entra tenant or in this particular Entra tenant. So the user accounts are differentiated based on the Entra tenant. And these users also can authenticate to the Azure and access the services. And similarly, the users of this tenant also can access the services. Then we have called as a custom domain. So the Azure will provide a called as a custom domain where we can create, and we don't want to have this name for our users. So this is the default Entra ID tenant name created, but when we are creating user accounts, it's giving like in this one, but I don't want to have like this one. So I want to have the name like instead of this, I want to have like a username acutelearn.com. So I want to have my own domain name for all my users, which I create in Entra and so this is where we call it as, and we can have an additional domain mapped to the existing tenant, which we called as a custom domain, but we cannot remove this particular name. We cannot remove this particular name. So this name is created default, but we can create an alias, what we can call it as in a name called as a terminology called as an alias, which we call it as a custom domain. Custom domain. So you can use that, and we can, based on requirement to requirement, we can create these custom domains. As we'll see as we go on, how we can add the custom domain and create user accounts. So this Azure AD is a free. The basic version of the Azure Entra ID is free because Microsoft has to provide the basic services, basic authentication, user management services. It comes as part of the and Azure and as well as 365 Cloud. However, Microsoft will provide called as a premium plans, which is called as a P1, like in P2 plans, where we want to have additional security, like an identity governance, like in privileged management, identity protection. There are so many security features available on these cloud platform. So when we want to have these additional kind of a security features, then we have to go with P1, P2. But as we go on, I'll talk more about these uh, the editions, because wherever required, we'll talk about which the edition is going to provide that particular features of it. So let's look at that, how we can, how the Entra ID looks. So when I'm going to the Azure portal, so on the menu item, we would find called as Entra ID. There's an Entra ID. So what happens here, we can see that when you go to the Entra ID overview, we can see called as a primary domain name called as in Vallam vramana1 gmail.onmicrosoft.com. Vallam vramana1 gmail.onmicrosoft. So this is my default tenant which is got created. Okay. Entra ID free, devices 3, application 70, groups 53, users like in 46, which I created. Down we can see the users, list of user accounts which are existing, okay, and groups, like a lot of other things which are available. So whenever we want to go into that, you can simply go into the menu item and expand, then you can go for enter. If you don't find it here, you can type here called as an Entra ID and Microsoft Entra ID, which can be available. Okay, so this way we can interact with the Microsoft Entra ID. So as we go on, we'll learn more about